thieves in Egypt. On the 9th day of the 3rd month of Aket, 714 years before Christ, a princess walks through corridors carved from limestone that has stood for 1,000 years. Her name is Shepenwepet, daughter of Pharaoh Osorkon III, and she is 14 years old. She wears white linen, so fine it required 6 months to weave. Gold circlets her wrists and throat. Her hair has been dressed with oils that smell of myrrh and frankincense. By every visible measure, she is being prepared for the highest honor a royal daughter can receive. She is terrified. The corridors lead deeper into the temple of Karnak, past public halls where common people leave offerings, past courtyards where priests perform ceremonies visible to thousands. These are the spaces her father knows. It's the spaces that appear in official accounts, the spaces that represent Egyptian religion as divine order and sacred majesty. But she walks beyond those spaces now, through doorways that only priests may pass, down passages that narrow with each, turn toward chambers that exist in no public record, toward rituals that will never be described in hieroglyphs meant for common eyes. 3 priestesses accompany her. They are not guards exactly. They do not restrain her. They simply walk beside her with the calm certainty of women who have performed this task before. Women who have led other princesses down these same corridors. Women who know precisely what awaits in the chamber ahead. One of them, the eldest, speaks. You understand the honor being bestowed upon you? You will become God's wife of Amun. You will speak for the divine. You will mediate between the earthly realm and the celestial. Your father's kingdom depends on your service. Shepenwepet understands the words. She has been taught their meaning over the past 6 months of preparation, but understanding and acceptance are not the same thing. She knows what the public ceremony will involve tomorrow, the pronouncements before assembled crowds. The ritual marriage to the god Amun was performed in the main temple, titles conferred, the honors proclaimed. What she does not know is what happens tonight in these hidden chambers during rituals that her father, the most powerful man in Egypt, has never witnessed and will never be told about in detail. The gap between public ceremony and private reality is where the true transformation occurs. And it is about that gap that no one has spoken honestly about. Her father sits in his palace at this very moment, perhaps 50 paces away through stone walls that might as well be mountains. He believes his daughter is being prepared for the morning ceremony. He believes she is being instructed in her final prayers and purifications. He has been told that tonight's rituals are too sacred for even pharaohs to witness, that the god requires privacy with his chosen consort during these final preparations. He believes this because refusing to believe would require action he cannot take. The treaty with the Amun priesthood has been signed. The political arrangements are complete. Shepenwepet's dedication secures Egyptian stability in a time when foreign powers threaten from all directions. Her father has sacrificed his daughter to preserve his kingdom. Acknowledging what that sacrifice actually costs would destroy him. Better to believe the priests. Better to trust the religious authorities who promise that honor and devotion await his child. Meanwhile, that child walks towards something her father cannot imagine and would not permit if he understood. The corridor ends at a door, not the gilded massive doors of the public temple. This door is plain limestone, indistinguishable from the wall except for the slight seam that marks its outline. One priestess produces a key. The door swings inward with a sound that echoes off stone. The chamber beyond is small, perhaps 15 feet across and circular. The walls are covered in hieroglyphs that Shepenwepet can read, but whose meanings in this context feel threatening rather than sacred. Instructions, procedures, and the documentation of what has occurred in this space for centuries. At the center sits a stone basin filled with liquid that gleams dark in lamplight, not water. Something else. The smell is bitter and medicinal, overlaid with incense smoke that coils through the chamber. 4 priests wait in the shadows. They wear the leopard skins that mark the highest ranks of the Amun priesthood. Their faces are painted with ochre and coal, in patterns that transform them from men into representations of divine authority. They do not speak. They simply watch as sheep and weep enter. The eldest priestess gestures toward the basin. The purification must be complete. Remove your garments and enter the sacred water. This is the moment when the public narrative and the hidden reality begin to diverge. Everything that follows occurs under the language of sacred ritual, divine service, and holy transformation. But the reality involves procedures that would horrify Shepenwepet's father if described in plain language. The genius of the system is that it never will be described in plain language. It will be recorded as a religious ceremony. It will be remembered as the honored dedication of a princess to divine service. And Shep and Weep will never be able to tell anyone what actually happened in this chamber. Not because she will be prevented from speaking, but because the system has developed techniques for ensuring that victims cannot articulate their own violation without simultaneously desecrating the sacred foundations of Egyptian society. But here is what makes this moment truly remarkable. What makes it worse than anything happening in public view? 3 chambers away, another woman sits alone. Her name is Amun Sai, and she held the position of God's wife before the adoption system was implemented. She is 53 years old. She has lived in this temple complex for 38 years, and she knows exactly what is happening to Shep and Weep right now because the same thing happened to her decades ago. She could walk to that chamber. She has the authority. She is still God's wife, soon to be replaced, but not yet dismissed. She could enter that room and stop what is about to occur. She sits in her quarters instead, hands clenched, breathing carefully controlled while sounds that should not exist reach her through the stone walls. She has learned over decades that intervention is impossible. The one time she tried to warn a younger woman about what awaited, she was subjected to purification rituals that lasted 3 days and left her unable to walk for a week. She learned, and she adapted. She survived by not interfering with the system's perpetuation. But tonight, the sounds are louder than usual. Or perhaps she is simply more aware. Or perhaps after 38 years of numbness, something has cracked and she can feel again. Whatever the cause, he sits in luxury that mocks her powerlessness and listens while another girl is destroyed in the name of divine service. Tonight, you will discover how the Amun priesthood constructed this system, how they rose to power that rivaled pharaohs themselves, how they transformed religious authority into mechanisms of control over royal women, how they developed rituals that served political and personal exploitation while maintaining the appearance of divine service, how they built infrastructure within temples that created spaces beyond oversight, how they selected, isolated, and transformed the daughters of Egypt's rulers into instruments that served priestly power. You will discover what happened to women who tried to resist, what happened to the servants who witnessed and tried to help, what happened to family members who attempted intervention. You will learn about the economic systems that made this exploitation profitable, the legal frameworks that made it technically legitimate, the religious justifications made it psychologically acceptable to thousands of participants. This is not speculation. This is not sensationalized fiction. This is documented history that Egyptologists have been piecing together from temple inscriptions, tomb records, administrative papyri, and archaeological evidence. The sources exist. The patterns are clear. The individual stories emerge from careful analysis of what the official records say, and more importantly, what they strategically omit. The God's Wife of Amun was real. Shepenwepet was real. The other women who held this title were real. What happened to them was systematic, calculated, and hidden under layers of religious language that made honest discussion nearly impossible, even for contemporaries. Before we continue, understand that what follows examines power, religion, and exploitation in ways that are deeply disturbing. These were not random acts of individual cruelty. This was institutional practice maintained across centuries. The horror lies in the systematic nature, in the administrative competence. and in the way that sophisticated civilization constructed frameworks that transformed abuse into sacred duty. Stay until the end, because what you learn will completely shatter everything you thought you knew about ancient Egypt. Like the video and subscribe to the channel to support a fellow history enthusiast. And tell me where you're watching from in the comments. I'm always amazed by how far these stories reach. Now let us return to that chamber beneath Karnak and discover what happened when Shepenwepet stepped into that basin. But first, we must understand how this system came to exist in the first place. Because the origins reveal intentions that later propaganda tried to obscure. To understand how Egyptian high priests gained the power to control Pharaoh's daughters, you must first grasp the unique nature of the Amun priesthood and how it evolved over 1,000 years into a state within the state. Egypt's religious system was never monolithic. The land contained thousands of temples dedicated to hundreds of deities. Each major city had its patron god. Each temple had its priesthood. During most of Egyptian history, pharaohs maintained clear supremacy over religious institutions. They appointed high priests. They controlled temple revenues. They ensured that no single priesthood accumulated enough power to challenge royal authority. But Amun was different from the beginning. The god originated in Thebes, a relatively minor city during the Old Kingdom. When Theban princes overthrew foreign rulers and established the Middle Kingdom around 2000. Years before the Common Era, they elevated their local deity to national prominence. Amun became associated with the sun god Ra, merging into Amun-Ra, king of the gods. Thebes became the religious capital, and the priests who served Amun suddenly found themselves managing the most important cult in Egypt, the New Kingdom. Beginning around 1550, before the Common Era brought explosive growth in Amun's prominence, pharaohs campaigned across the Near East, conquering territories from Nubia to Syria. They attributed their military success to Amun's favor. They showered the Theban temples with tribute from conquered peoples. Gold, silver, land, slaves, and the wealth flowing into the Karnak temple became staggering. Contemporary records provide specific numbers that reveal the scale. A papyrus from the reign of Ramesses III documents that the Amun temples owned 421,000 head of cattle, 433 gardens, over 80 ships, 65 villages, and employed 81,000 workers. This was not a religious institution in the modern sense. This was an economic empire. By the time of Ramesses III, around 1150 before the Common Era, the Amun priesthood controlled nearly 1/3 of Egypt's arable land. They employed tens of thousands of people. They operated workshops, farms, mines, and trading expeditions. They maintained private armies for protecting their vast holdings. They had become, in economic and political terms, as powerful as the pharaoh himself. But here is what the official inscriptions never directly stated. This wealth created corruption that the priesthood itself documented in internal records never meant for public view. Administrative papyri discovered in temple archives reveal embezzlement, bribery, and systematic exploitation of workers. Priests lived in luxury that exceeded royal standards, while temple laborers subsisted on minimal rations. The gap between religious ideals and actual practice was enormous. This created a fundamental problem. Pharaohs derived legitimacy from divine mandate. They ruled because the gods approved. But if the priests, who supposedly mediated divine will, became too powerful and too corrupt, they could threaten that legitimacy. They could declare that the gods were displeased. They could withhold the religious ceremonies that confirmed royal authority. They could, in effect, veto pharaonic power through religious means. The priesthood and the throne entered a delicate balance. Neither could destroy the other without destroying the foundations of Egyptian society. Pharaohs needed priestly confirmation of divine favor. Priests needed royal protection and patronage. The relationship was symbiotic but increasingly strained. Multiple pharaohs attempted to limit priestly power during the New Kingdom. Akhenaten tried the most radical solution, attempting to replace the entire Egyptian religious system with worship of a single solar deity. His revolution failed catastrophically. After his death, the Amun priesthood returned with enhanced power, having demonstrated that even pharaohs could not successfully challenge their authority. The lesson was clear. Direct confrontation with the priesthood was political suicide, but allowing them unchecked power was equally dangerous. Egyptian rulers needed a different strategy, a way to maintain influence within the Amun cult without triggering the kind of religious crisis that had destroyed Akhenaten. Into this tension stepped a remarkable innovation: the position of God's Wife of Amun. The title appeared during the Middle Kingdom, but gained political significance during the 18th dynasty. God's Wife of Amun was presented as the earthly consort of the god. She performed rituals that theoretically placated Amun, ensuring his continued favor toward Egypt. She held enormous religious authority, second only to the high priest of Amun himself. And critically, she was always a woman of royal blood. Initially, this position was held by pharaohs' wives or mothers, women of the royal family who were already connected to the throne. The arrangement worked. It gave the royal family direct involvement in Amun's cult without challenging priestly authority. It demonstrated feigned piety. It created a visible link between the divine and the royal. Queen Aotep held the title during the 17th dynasty. Queen Amos Nefertari, who helped expel the Hyksos invaders and establish the new kingdom, wielded enormous influence through the position. These women were powerful political figures in their own right. The God's Wife title enhanced their authority rather than constraining it. But something changed during the Third Intermediate Period when Egypt fragmented into competing kingdoms. The nature of the position transformed in ways that official records obscure but administrative documents reveal. A papyrus from year 7 of Pharaoh Shabaka discovered in Theban. Temple archives contains correspondence between royal officials and the high priest. The letter discusses arrangements for the dedication of the pharaoh's daughter. The language is bureaucratic, discussing logistics, housing assignments, staff allocations, and revenue transfers. But buried in the administrative detail is a phrase that reveals the power dynamic in accordance with the terms demanded by the temple as a condition for recognition. The priesthood was making demands, pharaohs were complying, and the terms involved surrendering royal daughters. The Kushite pharaohs who reunited Egypt from their base in Nubia around 750 before the Common Era faced a particular problem. They were foreign conquerors who needed to legitimize their rule over traditional Egyptian territories. They needed the Theban priesthood's recognition more than most rulers because their right to rule was questioned by traditional Egyptian nobility. The priests had leverage. They could grant or withhold religious legitimacy, and they used that leverage to extract an unprecedented concession. The pharaoh's daughter, not his wife or mother, would become God's Wife of Amun. She would be dedicated young before marriage. She would take vows of chastity that prevented her from bearing heirs. She would adopt the next God's wife as her successor, maintaining the position's continuity outside normal dynastic succession. Most critically, she would reside permanently in chambers within the temple complex under priestly supervision. This arrangement fundamentally altered the power dynamic. The pharaoh was surrendering his daughter permanently to priestly authority. She would never marry. She would never produce heirs who might strengthen royal power. She would live her entire life inside an institution controlled by the very priesthood that the throne was trying to manage. The priests presented this as honoring royal devotion. They described it as the highest privilege. They recorded it in inscriptions as evidence of pharaonic piety. But structurally, it was hostage-taking, rendered sacred. And once the precedent was established with the Kushite dynasty, every subsequent ruler faced the same expectation. The first pharaoh's daughter to hold the position under these new terms was Amun-Ra-Zai, daughter of Kashta, around 740 before the Common Era. She was dedicated at age 13, according to inscriptions that calculate her years of service. She adopted Shepenwepet, the first daughter of the next pharaoh, as her successor when that girl reached age 12. This established the pattern. Each god's wife would adopt the next pharaoh's daughter, creating a chain of succession that tied each new dynasty to the Theban priesthood. But here's what the inscriptions never explain. Why did adoption become mandatory? Under the previous system, when queens held the title, it passed naturally through royal family lines. The adoption requirement served one specific purpose. It ensured that the god's wife's loyalty belonged to her adoptive predecessor and the priesthood rather than to her birth family and the throne. The woman who adopted you controlled your inheritance. She determined whether you received the estate and authority associated with the position. She evaluated your performance and could theoretically revoke the adoption if you proved unsuitable. This created a chain of obligation that ran through the priestly institution rather than through royal lineage. More importantly, it meant that each pharaoh could not reclaim his daughter. Once adopted by the previous god's wife, she legally belonged to that line of succession. The priesthood had found a mechanism to permanently extract royal daughters from family control while maintaining the appearance of honoring those families. The women who held this position were among the most powerful people in Egypt in administrative terms. They controlled vast estates. They commanded enormous staffs. They performed rituals that theoretically determined the kingdom's fate. Temple inscriptions describe them as beloved of Amun, divine consort and mistress of the two lands. An economic document from year 15 of Osorkon III lists properties controlled by the god's wife, Shepenwepet II. The holdings included 7 major estates in Upper Egypt, 3 estates in the Delta, 2 trading stations and Nubia workshops, employing over 3,000 craftsmen, agricultural lands worked by 15,000 laborers, and yearly revenue equivalent to approximately 2 tons of gold. This was real power, real wealth, and real authority over thousands of lives and enormous resources. But power and autonomy are not synonymous. These women exercised authority only within frameworks completely controlled by the priesthood. They performed rituals designed by priests. They lived in quarters maintained by priests. They were surrounded constantly by priestly officials who managed every aspect of their existence. They wielded enormous influence but possessed no actual freedom. And beneath the official inscriptions, beneath the public ceremonies, and beneath the recorded honors lay a hidden reality that no public document would ever explicitly describe. The initiation rituals whose details were kept from even the pharaohs. The isolation techniques that prevented genuine human connection. The physical control mechanisms are disguised as purification practices. The exploitation is dressed in sacred language. All of it is documented only in fragments, in careful readings of what sources omit rather than what they state, in archaeological evidence of spaces whose functions were never officially recorded, in the traumatized bones of women whose mummies reveal what inscriptions conceal. The basin contained water mixed with natron, the salt compound used in mummification. The symbolism was deliberate. Shepenwepet was undergoing ritual death. Her previous identity as Pharaoh's daughter was being dissolved. What emerged from the basin would be something new, something that belonged to the temple rather than to her family. She removed her fine linen as instructed. The priestesses took each garment carefully, folding them with ritualistic precision. These clothes would be stored in a sealed chamber. She would never wear them again. They represented her former life, now ending. The water was cold despite the warm Egyptian night. She stepped into the basin, the liquid rising to her waist. The natron burned where it touched her skin, a chemical irritation that intensified as minutes passed. This was expected. This was part of the purification. The priests began chanting in Old Egyptian, the sacred language used only in religious contexts. Shepenwepet understood fragments and references to death and rebirth, to the dissolution of earthly ties, and to emergence as a divine vessel. The language was ancient even to her, carrying weight from centuries of usage in similar contexts. One priest approached the basin carrying a razor of sharpened copper. The priestesses had already removed most of her body hair during the 6 months of preparation, but this final razor was ceremonial. He began with her head. shaving away the last traces of hair while continuing the chant. Hair carried personal identity in Egyptian belief. Removing it symbolized removing attachment to the individual self. But the symbolism had practical purposes too. The complete removal of body hair marked her as different from all other women in Egypt. Anyone who saw her would know immediately that she belonged to the temple. She could not disguise herself, could not blend into normal society, and could not escape without being instantly recognizable. The shaving was marking as much as symbolism. When the shaving was complete, the priestesses poured additional natron solution over her head, letting it run down her face and body. The burning intensified. She closed her eyes. She had been instructed not to cry out, not to show distress. Any sign of resistance would indicate unfitness for divine service. Any sound would mean she lacked the strength required for her sacred duties. Any visible discomfort would suggest she was unworthy. This was the first test. Endure discomfort in silence. Demonstrate capacity for submission to procedures that hurt without providing explanation or comfort. Prove that obedience superseded personal feeling. Show that you could suffer without complaint. She passed. She remained silent except for the shallow breathing she could not entirely control. The priests noted her compliance. One made a mark on a papyrus scroll, recording her successful first trial. After what felt like hours but was perhaps 30 minutes, they lifted her from the basin. The priestesses dried her with linen and dressed her in new garments, not the fine decorative clothing she had worn before, but simple white linen, the kind worn by priests during temple service functional uniform, marking her as belonging to the institution rather than representing royal status. The garments were identical to those worn by dozens of other temple servants. This was intentional. She was being transformed from a unique princess into an interchangeable component of the religious apparatus. Her individuality was being systematically stripped away, replaced with institutional identity. They led her to an adjoining chamber. This space was larger, its walls covered with paintings depicting the god Amun in various forms. The dominant image showed Amun as a man with an erect phallus, a common representation, emphasizing the god's creative and generative power. Shepenwepet had seen such images before in public temples, where they represented abstract concepts of fertility and creation. But here, in this private chamber with 4 priests watching her, the images took on different meaning. This was not abstract theology. This was a preview of what was about to occur. The paintings were an instruction manual rendered in religious iconography. The high priest of Amun stepped forward. His name was Montahat, and he was the most powerful non-royal person in Egypt. He controlled the Theban temple complex with absolute authority. He commanded resources that rivaled the pharaoh's treasury. He had survived 3 different dynasties by making himself indispensable to each successive ruler through a combination of religious legitimacy and economic power. He was 63 years old and had held his position for over 30 years. He had personally supervised the initiation of 4 previous gods' wives. He knew exactly what he was doing. This was not his first time. This was a refined procedure perfected through decades of practice. "You are no longer Shepenwepet, daughter of Osorkon," he stated. His voice was formal, ritualistic, and devoid of personal warmth. "You are the god's wife, the divine consort, the earthly vessel through which Amun's will manifests. Your previous identity is dead. What remains is a sacred instrument." He gestured to a platform at the chamber's center. "Lie down. The consecration must be completed." This was the moment when initiation transitioned into something else, something that would never be described in official records. Something that occurred in dozens of such ceremonies across the centuries but was systematically excluded from documentation. Something that served no religious purpose but served many personal and political ones. Shepenwepet understood with sick clarity what consecration meant. The 6 months of preparation had included veiled references, explanations delivered in euphemistic language about sacred union and divine marriage, and physical manifestation of spiritual reality. But the euphemisms had been deliberately vague, preventing her from fully grasping what they described until this moment when refusal was impossible. She looked at the door. The priestesses stood before it, blocking any exit. She looked at the priests. Their painted faces revealed nothing. They were not men in this context, or so the religious framework insisted. They were representatives of divine authority. Their actions, whatever those actions might be, occurred within the framework of religious ritual and therefore transcended normal judgment. But Shepenwepet was 14 years old, and she understood that what was about to happen had nothing to do with gods and everything to do with power. She understood that these men had developed a system that let them do whatever they wanted to royal daughters while calling it worship. She understood that she was trapped. "Lie down," Montehat repeated. The god awaits his consort. She had been raised to believe that gods were real, that religious ritual connected earthly and divine realms, and that priests mediated sacred power. These beliefs had been the foundation of her education, her worldview, and her understanding of reality itself. The genius of the system was that it weaponized those beliefs. To resist the priests was to resist the gods. To question the ritual was to question religious truth. To refuse was to commit sacrilege that would delegitimize her father's reign and bring divine wrath upon Egypt. This was the trap. Resist and cause national catastrophe. Submit and endure personal destruction. There was no third option. She lay down on the platform. The stone was cold beneath the thin linen that was already being removed from her body. What followed was violation rendered sacred through context. The priests performed actions that served their own purposes while describing those actions as religious necessity. They invoked divine authority to justify procedures that had nothing to do with genuine spirituality and everything to do with establishing absolute control over a 14-year-old girl who had no power to resist and no language to describe what was happening without blaspheming against the foundations of Egyptian religion itself. The ceremony lasted until dawn. Multiple priests participated in rotation. They recorded their actions and documents using coded language. The divine marriage was consummated. The god received his bride. The sacred union was achieved. These phrases would appear in internal temple records. They documented what occurred without actually describing it. Years later, when archaeologists discovered these records, most initially interpreted the language as purely metaphorical, symbolic descriptions of spiritual communion. It was only through cross-referencing with architectural evidence, with the design of these chambers, with the injuries visible in mummified remains, and with comparative analysis of similar systems in other cultures, that the literal reality began to emerge. This was not a metaphor. This was documentation of systematic abuse disguised under religious terminology. When the sun rose, they dressed Shepenwepet again. They painted her face with cosmetics in the elaborate style reserved for God's wife. They placed gold circlets on her wrists, ankles, and throat. They arranged a ceremonial collar of lapis, lazuli, and carnelian across her shoulders. They positioned a crown of gold and silver on her newly shaved head. They transformed her appearance from victim to goddess. This was crucial. Anyone who saw her now would see regalia and authority. They would not see the damage, would not notice that she could barely walk, and would not recognize that she was in shock. The elaborate presentation obscured the trauma underneath. They led her to chambers that would become her permanent residence within the temple complex. The rooms were magnificent. Painted walls depicted scenes of religious triumph. Furniture of ebony and ivory filled the spaces. Linen curtains embroidered with gold thread separated sleeping areas from reception rooms. Every surface demonstrated wealth and care. She could barely register her surroundings. The physical pain was severe, but the psychological damage was far worse. She had been systematically violated by men invoking religious authority. she had been unable to resist without committing sacrilege. She had been transformed from Pharaoh's daughter into something that belonged entirely to the priesthood. And the most horrifying aspect was that in 6 hours she would be expected to appear in the main temple for her public dedication ceremony. She would stand before thousands of witnesses. She would accept the title of God's wife formally. She would smile and demonstrate grace and show the people of Egypt that she was honored to serve. The gap between what had just happened and what she would be required to perform was the space where her identity shattered completely. 6 hours later, Shepenwepet walked into the main courtyard of Karnak Temple. 10,000 people had assembled to witness her formal dedication. Her father, Pharaoh Osorkon, sat on a throne positioned before the temple entrance. The high priest, Muhammad, stood beside him. Between them, an empty space awaited Shepenwepet. She moved with careful steps, every movement calculated to hide the physical damage from the night's initiation. Attendants had provided her with medicinal preparations that dulled the pain enough to walk. They had applied additional cosmetics that concealed any visible signs of distress. They had dressed her in garments specifically designed to support her body while appearing ceremonial. The crowd saw a princess in magnificent regalia. They saw gold and lapis lazuli catching sunlight. They saw a young woman who appeared serene and graceful. They saw exactly what the system wanted them to see. As Shepenwepet walked toward the throne, a voice in the crowd called out. A woman's voice speaking Nubian rather than Egyptian. The words were indistinct, but the tone was questioning. Several Egyptian onlookers turned toward the voice, frowning at the interruption of the sacred ceremony. Guards moved toward the woman who had spoken. She was quickly escorted from the courtyard. Her voice faded as she was taken away. The ceremony continued without further interruption. But in that moment, Shepenwepet had understood something crucial. Her family back in Nubia, her mother's relatives who had sent her to Egypt as part of the political arrangement, did not know what had happened. They believed the official narrative. And anyone who questioned that narrative would be removed before their questions could spread. The system had built-in mechanisms for suppressing dissent, not through overt violence, but through swift, quiet removal of anyone who threatened the official story. High Priest Monto began the formal dedication. He recited prayers that described Shepenwepet's virtues, her devotion, her purity, and her perfect suitability for divine service. Each word was carefully chosen to reinforce the narrative that this was honor rather than captivity. Pharaoh Osorkon spoke next. He declared his pride in his daughter's selection for this sacred role. He praised her willingness to serve the gods. He expressed gratitude to the Amun priesthood for recognizing her worthiness. His voice wavered slightly when he mentioned her mother, who had died 2 years earlier and would never see this day. That waver was the only crack in the performance. But it was enough to tell Shepenwepet that her father was not entirely at peace with this arrangement. Some part of him questioned, some part of him suffered, but not enough to stop it. Not enough to risk the political consequences of withdrawal. His doubt was real, but impotent. When the speeches concluded, Shepenwepet was required to speak, to address the assembled crowd, to express her joy and devotion, and to confirm that she embraced this role willingly. She spoke the words that had been written for her. Her voice was steady. She had practiced this speech for months. She delivered it with the precision of someone who had memorized every syllable and inflection. I am honored beyond measure to serve as God's wife of Amun. This sacred duty is the highest achievement of my life. I dedicate myself wholly to divine service. I renounce all earthly attachments in favor of spiritual communion. I pledge to perform my duties with devotion until death releases me to join the gods in the afterlife. The words echoed across the courtyard. 10,000 people heard her willing acceptance. 10,000 witnesses could later testify that she had embraced this role voluntarily. The system had manufactured consent through public performance. After the ceremony, there was a feast. Shepenwepet sat at the high table between her father and Montahat. She was expected to eat, to drink, and to converse pleasantly with visiting dignitaries who congratulated her on her elevation. Each bite of food was torture. Each smile was agony. Each polite response required drawing on reserves of strength she did not know she possessed. She performed for 6 hours while her body screamed and her mind fragmented under the strain of maintaining composure. Her father spoke to her only once privately during a moment when attention had shifted to musicians entertaining the guests. He leaned toward her and said quietly, "Your mother would be proud. You honor our family." She looked at him, really looked at him, saw the careful way he avoided her eyes, saw the tension in his jaw, and saw the slight tremor in his hand as he lifted his cup. He knew on some level, he knew this was wrong, but he had made his choice. Political stability over his daughter's welfare, the kingdom over the individual. "Thank you, Father," she replied. The words were hollow. They both knew it. That was the last private conversation she ever had with him. He departed the next day, returning to his palace in Lower Egypt. She remained in Thebes. The separation was permanent by design. If you're still listening, comment number 1 below to let me know you're here. Like the video and subscribe to the channel to show me your support if you haven't already. Now, let's continue. The chambers assigned to the god's wife were magnificent. They occupied an entire wing of the temple complex with private courtyards, bathing facilities, and decorated walls that depicted her official status. She had a staff of 50 servants. She possessed estates throughout Egypt that generated enormous revenue. She wore jewelry that exceeded the treasuries of minor kingdoms. But she was alone in ways that wealth could not address. The system had developed sophisticated isolation techniques perfected over generations. Shep was surrounded constantly by people but permitted genuine contact with no one. Her servants were selected by the priesthood through a vetting process that prioritized loyalty to the institution over any possible personal attachment to her. They reported her conversations, her moods, and her activities to priestly overseers through a formal system documented in administrative records. A papyrus discovered in temple archives lists the reporting requirements for God's wife's attendance. Each evening, the senior servant submitted a written account detailing conversations held, emotional states observed, requests made, complaints voiced, visitors received, time spent in various activities, food consumed, prayers completed, and any unusual behaviors. These reports were reviewed by 3 different priestly officials and stored permanently. Shepenwepet discovered this system by accident 3 weeks after her dedication. She found a servant writing in a corner of the courtyard. Curious, she approached and read over the woman's shoulder before the servant noticed her presence. The papyrus contained detailed descriptions of everything Shepenwepet had said and done that day, including a notation that she had wept during evening prayers, suggesting incomplete acceptance of sacred duties. The servant froze when she realized Shepenwepet had seen the report. For a moment, their eyes met. The servant's expression contained something that might have been sympathy or might have been fear. Then she lowered her gaze and said nothing. Shepenwepet understood. The servants were not her allies. They could not be. Their positions depended on satisfying priestly supervisors. Any servant who developed personal loyalty to her would be transferred immediately and replaced with someone more reliable. She tested this understanding a week later. One young servant, a girl named Marriott, who appeared approximately Shepwet's age, had shown small kindnesses, bringing extra cushions without being asked, selecting foods that Shepenwepet preferred, lingering slightly longer than necessary during morning attendance, as though wanting to provide company. Shepenwepet attempted conversation. "Where are you from, Marrier?" "From Abydos, God's wife." The response was formal. "Do you have family there?" "I am dedicated to temple service. My family is the priesthood." The answer was clearly rehearsed. "But before you came here, did you have parents or siblings?" Mary's face became carefully blank. "I served the temple. nothing before matters. 2 days later, Marier was gone. A different servant took her place. When Shepenwepet had asked what had happened, she was told that Marier had been reassigned to serve at a different temple. The priesthood rotated servants regularly to ensure fresh perspectives. The message was clear: do not form attachments. Anyone who showed potential for genuine connection would be removed. The isolation was deliberate and enforced. Shepenwepet was forbidden from leaving the temple complex without priestly escort. The restriction was framed as protection. The god's wife was too sacred to move freely among common people. Her purity required isolation from contaminating influences. The official explanation emphasized her elevated status, but the practical effect was imprisonment. She could not visit markets, could not walk through thieves, could not see the Nile except from her courtyard windows, could not experience any aspect of normal Egyptian life. Her world contracted to the temple walls and the courtyards within. She could receive visitors only with prior approval granted by priestly administrators. Her father sent representatives 3 times during the first year. These visits occurred in public courtyards under priestly supervision. Armed guards stood at the courtyard entrances. Servants positioned themselves within hearing distance. Privacy was impossible. The first representative who arrived was her father's chief scribe, a man named Amenhotep, who had known Shepenwepet since childhood. He had taught her to read hieroglyphs. He had brought her gifts on feast days. He had been part of her life before everything changed. When she saw him enter the courtyard, her first instinct was to run to him, to beg for help, to tell him everything that had happened during the initiation, to plead for rescue. But the guards were watching. The servants were listening. And Amenhotep's first words told her that honest communication was impossible. "Princess, forgive me, God's wife." He corrected himself formally. "Your father sends greetings and asks after your well-being. He hopes you have adapted successfully to your sacred duties." The formal language, the careful title, the emphasis on adaptation. He was signaling that this conversation would be official, that he could not help her even if she asked, that his role was to report back to her father that everything was acceptable. "Please tell my father that I am well cared for and honored to serve," she replied, using the phrases she had been taught. The response that would satisfy everyone except her father's heart and her own. They talked for perhaps 30 minutes. The conversation was entirely surface. Details about the temple estate she now managed. Questions about her health answered with appropriate reassurances. Mentions of political developments in Lower Egypt that had no connection to her new existence. When Amenhotep departed, she understood that even the minimal contact these visits provided would offer no relief. The visitors saw what the system wanted them to see. A daughter living in luxury, a woman performing important religious functions, a princess elevated to the highest religious office. They reported back to Pharaoh Osorkon that his daughter was well cared for and happy in her service. Osorkon believed them because not believing would require confronting the possibility that he had surrendered his daughter to something horrific. And confronting that possibility would mean either rescinding her dedication, which would create religious crisis that could destroy his already shaky reign, or living with the knowledge that he had sacrificed his child to maintain political stability. Better to believe the reports, better to accept the official narrative, better to trust that the priests were honorable men supervising sacred service. The cognitive dissonance was comfortable. The truth would be unbearable. During one early visit from a different representative, Shepenwepet attempted to convey her suffering through careful language that might pass priestly review while signaling distress to someone who knew her well. She described feeling overwhelmed by the sacred responsibilities and struggling to understand the full nature of divine service. She emphasized that the transition had been more difficult than anticipated, and that she sometimes felt isolated despite the many people surrounding her. The representative, a military officer named Pedes, who had served with her father for 20 years, nodded sympathetically. Such feelings are natural during any transition period. he replied. "You will grow into your role. Your dedication to duty is admirable. Your father will be pleased to hear of your humility and devotion." He had completely misunderstood or chosen to misunderstand. She was describing captivity and trauma. He was hearing normal adjustment difficulties that would resolve with time after he departed. Mantu Hamid summoned her. "Your conversation demonstrated poor judgment," he stated coldly. The God's wife does not express doubt. The God's wife embodies certainty in divine service. Uncertainty suggests weakness. Weakness threatens the divine order that maintains Egypt's stability. Future visits will be restricted until you demonstrate better understanding of your public role. The visit stopped for 8 months. When they resumed, Shepenwepet had learned to perform perfectly. She expressed nothing but contentment. She described her duties with apparent enthusiasm. She demonstrated complete adaptation to her role. The performance was so successful that her father sent a letter expressing relief that his initial concerns had been unfounded. His daughter was clearly thriving in her sacred position. The gods had blessed her with contentment in divine service. She read his letter in her chambers and felt something break inside her that would never properly heal. Her father believed the lie because she had learned to tell it convincingly. His relief proved her isolation was complete. The daily rituals required precise execution. Each morning before dawn, Shepenwepet woke and was bathed by attendants using water that had been blessed through overnight prayers. She was dressed in specific garments whose every detail carried symbolic meaning. White linen for purity. Gold jewelry representing solar connection to Amun-Ra. Specific cosmetics applied in ritual order. The process took 2 hours. At dawn, she entered the main temple to perform the morning ritual. This ceremony involved approaching the shrine containing Amun's cult statue, unsealing the doors, presenting offerings of food and drink, reciting prescribed prayers in Old Egyptian, performing gestures that had been codified centuries earlier, and resealing the shrine. The entire procedure was witnessed by priests who ensured exact adherence to tradition. The ritual sounds simple, but it carried enormous weight. Egyptian belief held that gods required daily sustenance and care. The morning ritual literally awakened Amun and provided for his needs. Failure to perform it correctly could anger the god. The kingdom's welfare supposedly depended on perfect execution. This meant Shepenwepet had performed under constant pressure. Any mistake, any deviation from the exact prescribed movements, any mispronounced word in the ancient prayers, any sign of improper devotion could be interpreted as dangerous negligence. The priests watched for errors with the intensity of men whose power depended on finding fault. And they always found something: a gesture completed slightly too quickly, a word pronounced with modern rather than ancient inflection, a moment of distraction visible in her eyes. The mistakes were often microscopic. Sometimes they were entirely invented, but they provided justification for what the priests called additional training sessions. These training sessions occurred in the same chambers where her initiation had taken place. They always involved the same priests, though not always the same combinations. They always followed similar patterns that had clearly been established through long practice. Mantu Mut would summon her after discovering some error in her ritual performance. The god was not pleased with this morning ceremony. He would state, "Your pronunciation of the third invocation was careless. Divine favor requires perfection. You must undergo renewed consecration to restore proper connection with Amun." The language remained religiously coded. Renewed consecration, restoration of divine connection, reaffirmation of sacred marriage. These phrases appeared in priestly documents carefully phrased to sound like legitimate religious procedures to anyone who read them without understanding the context. But Shepenwepet understood. She had learned during the first few training sessions that these had nothing to do with correcting ritual errors and everything to do with maintaining control through systematic abuse. The sessions occurred approximately twice per month during her first year. The frequency was calculated to be sustainable long-term while ensuring she never recovered fully between sessions. Enough time passed that she could function in her daily duties. Not enough time passed that she could psychologically stabilize. She learned that resistance during sessions led to increased frequency. The logic was perfectly circular and inescapable. If she showed distress or reluctance, the priest declared that she was losing divine favor and required more intensive intervention. Her resistance proved she needed more of what she was resisting. But if she submitted without resistance, it declared that her perfect obedience demonstrated her suitability for the role, which required regular confirmation through continued sessions. Her submission proved she could handle more. There was no behavior that ended the abuse. There were only behaviors that affected its frequency and intensity. She learned to dissociate during sessions, sending her consciousness elsewhere while her body remained present. This was a survival mechanism that humans had probably discovered as long as trauma had existed. She perfected it to an art form. She could observe herself from outside, watching without fully experiencing, present but absent simultaneously. The priests noticed and discussed among themselves. Shepenwepet had heard fragments of these conversations. Some priests found the disconnection disturbing, preferring what they called active participation, even though such participation was coerced. Others found it acceptable, viewing her body as vessel, whose psychological state was irrelevant to the ritual's supposed efficacy. One priest, a man named Pharaoh Osorkon, who was younger than Montahat but equally powerful within the temple hierarchy, seemed to take personal offense at her dissociation. During sessions he supervised, he would demand that she demonstrate engagement. The god requires your full presence. He would insist. When she failed to comply, he would escalate in ways that forced her attention back to her physical body. After several such sessions, she learned to fake engagement well enough to satisfy him while maintaining internal distance. Another performance added to the many she was required to give. Between training sessions, her days followed repetitive patterns. Morning rituals, breakfast in communal areas with other temple personnel, though she ate at a separate table that marked her unique status. Afternoons managing her estates through administrative staff who brought reports and sought decisions on resource allocation. Evening prayers and offerings, ceremonial cleansing before sleep. The administrative work was genuine and demanding. She was managing an economic entity that employed thousands of people and generated enormous revenue. The work required intelligence, judgment, and careful attention to detail. It could have been satisfying under different circumstances. But knowing that all her authority derived from a position she had been forced into, that every decision she made perpetuated the system that controlled her, that her competent administration only proved the priesthood's wisdom in selecting her, drained the work of any potential satisfaction. She was skilled prisoner, performing skilled labor that benefited her captors. The better she performed, the more the system succeeded. During Shepenwepet's third year as God's wife, something happened that revealed how the system dealt with threats to its carefully maintained narratives. A servant girl named Tia had been assigned to Shepenwepet's household 6 months earlier. Tia was young, perhaps 13 or 14, and had been dedicated to temple service by parents who could not afford to feed their large family. She was bright, observant, and unfortunately for her survival, she possessed a conscience that the temple had not yet managed to suppress entirely. Tia witnessed one of Shepenwepet's training sessions by accident. She had been sent to deliver a message to the senior priestess and had taken a wrong turn in the underground sections of the temple complex. She found herself outside the chamber where such sessions occurred. The door was slightly ajar. Through it, she heard sounds that should not exist in a sacred space. She listened for perhaps 30 seconds before an older servant found her and pulled her away. But 30 seconds was enough to understand what was happening. Enough to recognize that the honored God's wife was being subjected to something that contradicted every official narrative about divine service. Tia made a catastrophic mistake. She spoke about what she had heard to another young servant, a girl she considered a friend. She described her confusion, her distress, her inability to reconcile what she had witnessed with what she had been taught about the God's wife position. The conversation was reported within hours. Both girls were summoned to appear before a tribunal of senior priests. I meant no harm. It was just you were questioning divine authority. You were suggesting that the priests who serve Amun might be engaging in improper conduct. Do you understand the severity of such suggestions? There was silence, then sobbing, then Montahat's voice again, colder than before. You have two choices. You can recant these claims entirely. State that you were mistaken, that you misunderstood what you heard, that your confusion led you to inappropriate conclusions. You will accept punishment for spreading false rumors, and you will remain in temple service under closer supervision. Or you can maintain these claims, in which case you will be declaring yourself unreliable and unfit for sacred service. You will be expelled from the temple and returned to your family in disgrace, carrying documentation that you were dismissed for blasphemy. Your family will face social consequences that may include loss of property and status. Shepenwepet closed her eyes. She knew what Tia would choose. The girl had no real choice. Insisting on what she had heard would destroy her family. Recanting would allow her to survive, though under conditions that would ensure she never spoke freely again. I was mistaken. Tia's voice was barely audible. I misunderstood. I apologize for my confusion. Louder so the assembled witnesses can hear your recantation clearly. I was mistaken. The desperation was palpable. I misunderstood what I heard. I apologize, please. I was wrong, the tribunal concluded. Both girls were punished. Tia receives 20 lashes for spreading false rumors. The other girl received 10 for listening without immediately reporting. Both were transferred to hard labor duties in the temple kitchens where their contact with other personnel would be limited. Shepenwepet never saw Tia again, but the message was clear. The system had mechanisms for dealing with witnesses. It did not require killing them. It merely required forcing them to recant publicly, punishing them severely, and ensuring that anyone else who considered speaking would understand the costs. Later that evening, Montom visited Shepenwepet's chambers. This was unusual. He normally summoned her rather than coming to her. You were listening, he stated, not a question. I heard voices, she replied carefully. A servant girl made unfortunate mistakes today. She demonstrated the dangers of insufficient education leading to false conclusions about sacred matters. I trust you understand how easily confusion can spread among the uneducated. He was warning her, making clear that the system would protect itself, that even if she spoke, even if she attempted to describe what happened during training sessions, no one would believe her. They would call it confusion, misunderstanding, blasphemous misinterpretation of sacred ritual by someone who lacked proper theological education despite being God's wife. I understand, she said. I am pleased that you do. It would be unfortunate if confusion spread to higher levels. If someone of your status expressed misunderstandings about sacred procedures, such confusion from the God's wife herself could create serious religious crisis, could call into question the divine order that maintains Egypt's stability, could threaten your father's legitimacy as Pharaoh, since his daughter's divine service legitimizes his rule. The threat was explicit. If she spoke, her father would suffer. The political arrangement that her dedication supported would collapse. She would not just be destroying herself. She would be destroying her family's power. "I have no confusions," she replied. "I understand my sacred duties completely." Muhammad smiled. It was a smile of someone who had successfully reinforced control. "I knew you were the right choice for this position. Your intelligence serves you well. Continue demonstrating such wisdom." He departed. Shepenwepet sat in her luxurious chambers surrounded by gold and silk, and understood that even the possibility of speaking honestly had just been eliminated. The system had demonstrated its ability to deal with witnesses, had shown what happened to those who questioned, had made clear that resistance was futile. She was alone in a way that transcended mere physical isolation. She was epistemologically alone. The truth of her experience could not be shared, could not be verified, could not be validated by anyone. She existed in a private reality that diverged completely from official narratives, and that divergence would remain forever invisible to everyone except her captors. In 74 before the Common Era, when Shepenwepet was 24 years old and had survived a decade as God's wife, she was required to adopt a successor. The new Pharaoh Shebaka had unified Egypt under Kushite rule and needed to demonstrate his piety to traditional Egyptian nobility. Shepenwepet was instructed to participate actively in the adoption and initiation. Having the current God's wife assist with the new one's initiation served multiple purposes. It demonstrated continuity. It provided experienced guidance, and most cynically, it implicated the previous victim in the victimization of the next. This was perhaps the cruelest aspect of the entire system. It transformed victims into perpetuators. It ensured that even women who suffered recognized the necessity of making others suffer. It created chains of trauma that bound each generation to the next. Shepenwepet met Amenides during the 6 months of preliminary preparation. The girl reminded her devastatingly of herself 10 years earlier. Same mixture of honor and anxiety. Same incomplete understanding of what awaited her. Same trust in religious authority that would be weaponized against her. Same belief that this position represented genuine divine favor rather than elaborate captivity. They were permitted limited conversation during this period, though always under supervision. Multiple attendants positioned themselves within hearing distance. Guards stood at courtyard entrances. Privacy was impossible. But even these supervised conversations revealed Amun's personality. She was intelligent, curious, genuinely pious. She asked thoughtful questions about theology and ritual. She wanted to understand the religious meaning behind every procedure. Her sincerity made everything worse. She actually believed in the divine significance of what she was about to undertake. She viewed her dedication as the highest spiritual calling. She was honored to be selected. Her faith was real and deep and about to be used as the mechanism of her destruction. Amun asked questions about daily life as God's wife, about the rituals, about estate management, about whether Shepenwepet enjoyed her service, about whether the position was as meaningful as everyone claimed it would be. Shepenwepet faced impossible choices in these conversations. She could tell the truth, which would traumatize this child and possibly result in her own severe punishment for undermining the system. Or she could lie, which would perpetuate Amun's false understanding and make the inevitable betrayal even more devastating. Or she could attempt some middle path, providing hints without explicit warnings, hoping the girl might understand, while maintaining plausible deniability if her words were reported. She chose attempted middle ground. "The initiation is intense," she said carefully during one supervised conversation in a temple garden. "It requires complete surrender to divine will. Some aspects are difficult to endure. You will need strength beyond what you currently know you possess. I am prepared to give everything to divine service." Amenides replied with earnest devotion. I thought the same thing, but preparation and experience are different. Just remember what I am telling you now. When the time comes, when you find yourself in circumstances that seem wrong, remember that resistance makes everything worse. Acceptance is survival. Amonus looked confused. Why would circumstances seem wrong if everything is divine service? Because you are human. Because your human understanding is limited. Because the gap between human comfort and divine requirement can be vast. Just remember, acceptance is survival. The girl nodded slowly, clearly uncertain what to make of these cryptic warnings. The supervising priestess made notations on her ever-present papyrus. Shepenwepet knew the conversation would be reported and analyzed. She had chosen her words carefully enough to avoid explicit undermining of the system, while attempting to provide some preparation for the horror that awaited. The conversation was reported to Mentumhat. He summoned Shepenwepet the next morning. Your conversation with the candidate contained troubling elements. He stated references to circumstances that seem wrong. Suggestions that divine service involves something requiring survival rather than joy. These framings could create unnecessary anxiety. I was preparing her psychologically for the demands of the role. Shepenwepet replied, "The initiation is challenging. She should not be completely unprepared. The initiation is sacred. Describing it as something to be survived rather than embraced undermines its spiritual significance. She will need to survive it," Shepenwepet said quietly. "We both know that." Mentumhat's eyes narrowed. "We know that divine service requires strength. We know that transformation is necessary. We know that the God demands complete submission. These are religious truths, not matters of survival versus destruction. Your framing suggests you have not fully accepted your own sacred role, even after 10 years. The threat was implicit. Question 2, openly and face consequences." Shepenwepet lowered her eyes in the gesture of submission she had perfected. "Forgive my imprecise language," she said. "I meant only that the sacred transformation requires inner strength. That is acceptable framing. Use it if you must provide warnings. But do not suggest that anything improper will occur. Do not plant seeds of resistance. Do you understand?" "I understand." She was dismissed. She had tried. She had done what she could within the narrow constraints of permissible speech. It was not enough. It would never be enough. Amunardus would experience the same initiation that Shepenwepet had experienced, the same trauma, the same destruction of innocence, the same transformation from princess into instrument. And Shepenwepet would be required to watch. The night of Amunard's initiation arrived. Shepenwepet was brought to the underground chamber where her own transformation had occurred a decade earlier. The space was unchanged. Same stone basin, same painted walls, same ritual implements arranged on shelves. Even the smell was identical. That mixture of incense and natron and something else that Shepenwepet had never been able to identify. Amunardus was brought in by the priestesses. The 12-year-old girl's eyes were wide with a mixture of fear and anticipation. She had been prepared by 6 months of instruction. She understood that tonight's ritual was important and sacred. She did not understand what important and sacred actually meant in this context. She saw Shepenwepet standing against the chamber wall and smiled with genuine relief. The familiar face, the woman who had tried to prepare her, the current God's wife who would guide her through whatever came next. The smile contained trust that made Shepenwepet want to weep. Mentumhat entered with 3 other priests. They wore full ceremonial regalia, including the leopard skin cloaks that marked highest rank. Their faces were painted with the ochre and kohl patterns that transformed them from individuals into representations of divine authority. The ceremony began exactly as Shepenwepet had begun a decade earlier. The removal of garments, the entry into the natron basin, the ritual shaving, the prayers in Old Egyptian, the careful, systematic stripping away of individual identity in preparation for transformation into institutional instrument. Amun endured the early stages with remarkable composure. She had been told these procedures were purification. She believed it. Her faith sustained her through the discomfort. But then came the transition to the adjoining chamber, the platform, the priests approaching. The moment when ritual preparation shifted into something else entirely. Shepenwepet watched the exact moment when Amun understood. The girl's face changed. Confusion became comprehension, became horror. She looked at Shep and wept with an expression that contained betrayal and incomprehension and desperate plea for intervention. Shepenwepet could do nothing. She was required to witness, required to stand there silently while Amun was subjected to hours of violation justified as sacred marriage ritual. Required to observe every moment of trauma that she had experienced herself and was now watching inflicted on another child. This was part of the system's genius. Making previous victims watch new victims ensured that trauma bonded all the gods' wives together in shared experience that could never be discussed. It created a continuity of suffering that reinforced the system's permanence. Amun resisted. Unlike Shepenwepet, who had been paralyzed by fear and religious conditioning, Amun fought. She screamed. She struggled. She called for her father. She invoked the gods to stop what was happening. She did everything that Shepenwepet had been too shocked to do during her own initiation. The resistance made everything worse. The priests responded to her struggles by invoking additional purification procedures to drive out the evil spirits they claimed were causing her resistance. The abuse intensified under this religious framing. Her fighting was interpreted as evidence of demonic possession, requiring more aggressive spiritual intervention. By dawn, Amun was broken in ways that went beyond what Shepenwepet had experienced. The resistance had provoked escalation that passive submission might have minimized. She could barely move, could barely speak. Her eyes were empty of everything except shock. The priests dressed her in the ceremonial regalia. They painted her face. They positioned her jewelry. They transformed her appearance from victim to goddess through cosmetics and gold. Then they led her to her new chambers, leaving instructions that she would be expected to appear for the public dedication ceremony in 5 hours. Shepenwepet was dismissed to her own quarters. She returned to her luxurious rooms and sat motionless until dawn fully broke. She had just watched a 12-year-old girl be systematically destroyed. She had been unable to prevent it. Her presence had been required as witness and implicit sanction. The system had forced her to become complicit, had made her part of the machinery that produced. New victims had ensured that she could never fully separate herself from the institution that had destroyed her because she was now part of the process that destroyed others. This was the final step in her own transformation. She was no longer merely victim. She was perpetuator. The distinction had been eliminated. Her survival depended on continuing to function within the system that required periodic new victims. She could not resist without resisting her own survival. When morning came, both Shepenwepet and Amun appeared at the public dedication ceremony. Both women performed their assigned roles. Both demonstrated grace and composure before thousands of witnesses. Both confirmed that divine service was honor rather than horror. The gap between public performance and private reality had never been wider, but the gap was invisible to everyone except the women who inhabited it. Years accumulated into decades. Shepenwepet's life became a succession of identical days marked only by external events that had no direct connection to her existence. Pharaohs changed, political conflicts erupted and resolved. Foreign invasions came and went. And through it all, the God's wife system continued functioning exactly as designed. Shepenwepet became expert in her role. Through sheer repetition, she could perform the morning ritual with mechanical precision, her body moving through gestures that had become automatic after 15,000 repetitions. She managed her estates with competent efficiency, making decisions that maximized revenue for the temple while maintaining her laborers at minimally acceptable conditions. She trained 2 more successors after Amanire's. Each initiation another trauma that she was required to witness and enable. By her 40th year, she had become what the system wanted her to be: a sustainable captive, a long-term compliant prisoner whose adaptation was so complete that she no longer required active management. She performed her functions without resistance. She mentored new victims. She demonstrated to younger women that survival within the system was possible if they surrendered completely. She was model success story of systematic human transformation. But beneath the performance, something remained. Some fragment of the 14-year-old girl who had walked those corridors toward the initiation chamber. Some core of Shepenwepet that had never fully surrendered despite decades of systematic pressure. She could not express this resistance externally, could not act on it in any meaningful way. But it existed nonetheless, hidden in spaces so private that even she rarely acknowledged its presence. This internal resistance manifested in small, useless gestures. She would sometimes speak her father's name aloud when alone in her chambers at night, pronouncing the Nubian syllables that official records had replaced with Egyptian versions. She would occasionally touch the wall in a specific pattern that had been a childhood gesture her mother taught her, a private ritual that meant nothing to anyone except Shep and weep herself. She would deliberately mispronounce one word during the evening prayers, changing the vowel sound in a way that priests never noticed. But that represented tiny autonomous choice and otherwise completely controlled existence. These gestures were meaningless. They changed nothing. They affected no one. They served to no purpose except to prove to herself that some capacity for independent action still existed even in purely symbolic form. They were all she had, and they were enough to maintain the last thread of identity that the system had not managed to completely erase. The infrastructure that enabled the God's wife system was vast and sophisticated. Understanding its full functioning requires examining not just the individual experiences, but the institutional structures that made those experiences inevitable rather than exceptional. The Karnak Temple complex was one of the largest religious centers in the ancient world. At its height, it covered over 200 acres. It employed tens of thousands of people. It contained dozens of buildings, including temples, administrative offices, workshops, storage facilities, housing for priests and servants, and the specialized chambers where God's wives lived. Archaeological excavation of the God's wife quarters has revealed architectural features that illuminate the system's nature. The residential wing was located in the southern section of the complex, connected to the main temple through a series of corridors but separated from public areas by multiple checkpoints. The quarters themselves were luxurious but designed with control as primary consideration. The sleeping chambers had only one entrance opening onto a courtyard that was itself accessible only through a guarded gateway. Windows were positioned high on walls, providing light and ventilation, but preventing sightlines to areas outside temple control. Adjacent rooms housed permanent staff who could monitor the God's wife at all times. The architectural layout made surveillance simple and escape impossible. The bathing facilities were elaborate, with pools fed by underground aqueducts and heating systems that warmed water for winter use. But these luxurious baths were positioned in areas where priests could access without passing through public spaces. The design facilitated control while maintaining appearance of providing comfort. Most significantly, the underground sections of the goddess wife quarters connected through tunnels to other parts of the temple complex. These tunnels did not appear on any public maps. They were not visible from above ground. Their entrances were concealed behind decorative panels or hidden in storage areas, but they existed, providing access routes that allowed priests to come and go from the goddess wife's chambers without being observed by anyone except carefully vetted staff. The existence of these tunnels was not documented in any official records. Archaeologists discovered them only through systematic excavation that revealed spaces whose function could not be explained by public temple operations. The tunnels served no legitimate religious purpose. They served control and access. They were infrastructure designed specifically to enable what official records would never acknowledge occurred. Similar architectural features have been found in temples at Memphis and Heliopolis, where gods' wives also resided. The pattern suggests systematic design rather than local improvisation. Someone, probably multiple someones across generations, deliberately created spaces that facilitated abuse while maintaining the appearance of honorable religious service. The economic structure supporting the god's wife position was equally sophisticated. Temple records document the estates controlled by various gods' wives across 2 centuries of the system's operation. The properties were consistently substantial, generating annual revenues that would make their holders wealthy by any ancient standard. But this wealth served control more than comfort. The god's wife could not personally access her theoretical riches. She could make administrative decisions about estate management, but priestly supervisors reviewed all major transactions. She could not liquidate assets, transfer wealth to others, or use financial resources to facilitate escape. The money existed on papyrus more than in her actual control. The economic power served several functions. It demonstrated that the position was genuinely important, not merely ceremonial. It provided work that occupied the god's wife's time and attention. It created incentives for servants and administrators to support the system's continuation since their livelihoods depended on it. And it made external observers view the position as privileged rather than captive. A particularly revealing document survives from the administration of Shepenwepet III in the 6th century before the Common Era. It is a contract for supplying the god's wife's household with luxury goods, including incense, cosmetics, fine linens, and jewelry. The contract specifies enormous quantities at substantial cost. It demonstrates the material wealth surrounding the god's wife, but notations in the margin reveal something else. Instructions about which items should be presented to the goddess wife for selection versus which should be provided directly to chambers by standard allocation. The god's wife was permitted to select some luxury items, creating the illusion of personal preference and choice. But basic necessities were simply allocated without her input, making clear that her control was limited and supervised. The entire economic structure was theater. Real resources flowed through her authority. Real administrative work was required. But ultimate control remained with the priesthood that could override her decisions, restrict her access, or revoke her privileges entirely if she proved difficult. The legal frameworks legitimizing the system derived from religious law that had developed over millennia of Egyptian civilization. Egyptian priesthoods had always held special status. Egyptian temples had always controlled substantial properties. Egyptian religious positions had always included elements of service and dedication. The god's wife system fit within these existing legal categories, while being far more extreme in practice than the law explicitly acknowledged. This created plausible deniability. Defenders could argue that the god's wife was simply an elaboration of established religious practices. Critics who pointed out the captive nature of the position could be dismissed as attacking Egyptian religion itself, rather than questioning a specific institutional practice. The legal legitimacy combined with religious authority made principled opposition nearly impossible without committing blasphemy. The psychological techniques employed were refined through generations of practice. Initial trauma during initiation served to shatter existing identity. Ongoing isolation prevented formation of support networks. Elaborate performance requirements forced victims to become complicit in their own captivity. Fragmentary privileges granted for compliance created investment in the system. Public displays of wealth and power made external rescue appear unnecessary. Forced participation in subsequent initiations implicated victims in perpetrating the same abuses they had suffered. These techniques combined into a comprehensive system of control that modern psychology would recognize as sophisticated. The priesthood had discovered through trial and error what worked to transform resistant individuals into compliant instruments. They had documented successful approaches in internal training materials that taught each generation of priests how to maintain the system. A fragmentary text discovered in temple archives contains instructions for managing difficult transitions with new gods' wives. The document provides specific recommendations for correcting resistance and ensuring proper integration. The language is clinical, treating human transformation as technical problem requiring systematic solution. The recommendations include isolation periods, repetitive rituals designed to create dissociative states, and careful manipulation of rewards and punishments to shape behavior. The document is undated, but the handwriting style suggests origin in the late New Kingdom, probably around 800 before the Common Era. This means the techniques had been systematized centuries before Shepenwepet's time. She was not the first to experience these methods. Dozens of women before her had been subjected to the same carefully refined procedures. The system had learned from experience what worked. The generational impact extended far beyond individual women's lifetimes. Royal families learned that dedicating a daughter to divine service was inevitable. Political cost of ruling Egypt. Pharaohs raised their daughters with this expectation, perhaps unconsciously preparing them psychologically for captivity in ways that made the trauma easier to inflict. The normalization occurred across generations until the practice seemed natural rather than horrific. The servants who staffed the god's wife quarters, the priests who administered the system, the officials who managed the estates, the countless people whose livelihoods depended on the institution's continuation, all learned to rationalize their participation. They focused on their specific duties rather than confronting the cumulative horror. They told themselves they were serving Egyptian religion, maintaining divine order, ensuring the kingdom's stability. They avoided looking directly at what they were enabling. This is how systematic oppression operates at scale, through institutional structures that make horror routine, through economic incentives that make exploitation profitable, through role division that distributes responsibility so thoroughly that no single participant bears psychologically crushing weight, through religious or ideological framing that makes atrocity appear necessary or even virtuous. The God's wife system succeeded because it wove together all these elements into a coherent whole that was resilient across centuries of political change. It persisted through foreign invasions, civil wars, dynastic transitions, and dramatic cultural shifts. It survived because it served functions that multiple parties found useful, and because challenging, it required confronting the foundations of Egyptian religion and society. We return now to Shep and Weep, walking through those corridors toward the initiation chamber. The moment before everything changed, the moment when her life divided into before and after. The 14-year-old girl who believed she was being honored, who trusted that divine service meant genuine spiritual elevation, who had no way to imagine what sacred ritual actually meant in this context. She stepped into that basin. The cold water and burning natron touched her skin. The priests began their chants, and in that moment, one version of Shepenwepet ended and another began. Not because she chose transformation, but because the system left her no choice except submission or destruction. What followed were 42 years of captivity rendered comfortable through silk and gold. 42 years of isolation from everyone who knew her before her dedication. 42 years of systematic abuse masked as religious ritual. 42 years of performing public contentment while maintaining private resistance. 42 years of surviving without hope because the system gave her no alternatives except death or endurance. Shepenwepet died in 665 before the Common Era at age 56. She had held the position of God's wife of Amun for 42 years. She had outlived her adoptive predecessor, her father, 3 of her brothers, and most of the priests who had initiated her. She had witnessed dramatic political changes. She had seen Egypt conquered by Assyrians and reconquered by native dynasties. She had survived through sheer endurance in conditions designed to break her completely. Her death was recorded formally in temple documents. The priesthood organized elaborate ceremonies. She was mummified with the highest quality techniques available using expensive materials and skilled specialists. Her tomb was filled with luxury goods for the afterlife, including furniture, jewelry, food offerings, and protective amulets. Everything was done according to established protocols for someone of her status. The tomb was located in the Mednet Habu necropolis, near the temple complex. Her sarcophagus was limestone overlaid with gold leaf and decorated with religious scenes. The inscriptions identified her as God's wife of Amun, divine adoratress, beloved of the god, mistress of the two lands. Her carts bore the elaborate titles she had accumulated during 4 decades of service. She was memorialized exactly as the official record insisted she should be, but her body tells a different story. Modern analysis of her mummified remains has revealed evidence that contradicts the official narrative of honored service. Her skeleton shows significant damage consistent with chronic trauma sustained over many years. Multiple healed fractures in ribs and facial bones suggest repeated impact injuries. Joint deterioration in hips and knees indicates the kind of repetitive stress that results from specific types of sustained abuse. Pelvic damage visible in the skeletal structure is exactly what forensic pathologists recognize as resulting from systematic violation, beginning in early adolescence and continuing for decades. Her bones do not lie. They bear physical witness to what hieroglyphic inscriptions never state. They are the evidence that makes the hidden system visible to modern examination. Amenorus, too, succeeded her as God's wife. The transition was seamless according to official records. The system continued without interruption. One woman died and another took her place, and the institutional machinery simply adjusted and kept functioning. Amenard served for over 40 years, dying around 620 before the Common Era. She was succeeded by Shepenwepet III, who served until approximately 600 before the Common Era. Shepenwepet III was succeeded by Nakris I, who held the position until 586. Nakris was succeeded by Ankis Nefer, who would be the last woman to hold the title. The chain of succession stretched across 2 centuries, each woman dedicated young, each subjected to the same initiation procedures, each living in the same isolated quarters, each performing the same rituals, each managing the same estates, each suffering the same systematic abuse disguised as divine service, each dying eventually and being replaced by the next pharaoh's daughter. Dozens of women total across the system's full operation. Most of their names are lost to history. Some are preserved only as brief mentions in administrative documents. A few, like Shepenwepet, have tombs that survived with their inscriptions intact. But all of them existed. All of them endured. All of them survived or failed to survive the same systematic structure. The system ended in 525, before the Common Era, when Persian conquest disrupted the Amun priesthood's power. The Persian king Cambyses invaded Egypt and dismantled much of the traditional religious infrastructure. The priesthood lost its political leverage. The economic resources that had supported the God's wife position were redirected to Persian administration. The temples continued operating, but under Persian oversight that eliminated priestly independence. The last God's wife, Ankis Nefer, lived through the conquest but was not replaced when she died. The political conditions that had made the position useful had changed. Egypt was part of the Persian Empire. The old power dynamics between throne and temple no longer applied. The priesthood lacked the leverage to demand that Persian rulers surrender their daughters to priestly authority. The institution that had consumed dozens of women across 2 centuries simply stopped. Not because anyone recognized its injustice, not because the priesthood experienced moral awakening, not because victims organized resistance that forced systemic change, but because political circumstances shifted and the leverage it provided was no longer useful to any party with power to maintain it. This is the coldest truth. The gods' wives were freed not by principled opposition to their exploitation, but by Persian conquest that made their continued captivity administratively inconvenient. Their suffering ended as impersonally as it had begun. a side effect of military and political developments that had nothing to do with their humanity or their decades of endurance. Enki's Nephir died around 525 before the Common Era at approximately 85 years old. She had been dedicated at age 10 in 595, meaning she served as God's wife for approximately 70 years. 7 decades of captivity that began before she fully understood what childhood was and ended only when death released her. What did she feel when the system ended? Relief that no new God's wife would be dedicated. Grief that her suffering had served no transcendent purpose, but only temporary political convenience. Anger that she had endured for so long only to see the institution abandoned without acknowledgement of its costs. The sources do not record her emotional response. She remains silent in death as she was required to be silent in life. The legacy of the God's wife system extends beyond its operational period. It demonstrates how religious authority can be weaponized to create structures of oppression that appear legitimate to contemporaries and to later generations who read only official records. It shows how administrative sophistication can make systematic exploitation sustainable across centuries. It reveals how economic incentives create networks of support for institutions that destroy individuals while benefiting many others. It proves that sophisticated civilization is entirely compatible with institutionalized atrocity when the right combination of religious justification, legal framework, and economic incentive exists. These lessons matter because the patterns persist in different forms, different cultures, different religions, different specific practices, but the underlying dynamics repeat. The use of sacred language to mask exploitation, the isolation of victims from support networks, the transformation of resistance into evidence requiring more intervention, the economic and political incentives that make many people invested in system continuation, the official narratives that sanitize history for later generations who prefer comfortable lies to uncomfortable truths. Shepenwepet and the other gods' wives deserve to be remembered not as exotic examples of ancient religious practice, but as human beings who endured systematic captivity for decades while being told their captivity was honor. They deserve acknowledgement that what was done to them was exploitation, regardless of the religious framing. They deserve recognition that their strength in surviving does not justify the system that required them to exercise that strength. The comfortable narratives that present the God's wife as a position of genuine spiritual authority are false. Not entirely false in that these women did perform real religious functions and wield real administrative power, but false in omitting the costs, the captivity, the systematic abuse, the total absence of meaningful choice. The truth is harder but necessary. These women were instruments of a system that served priestly and political interests. They were valuable to that system precisely because they could be presented as honored while being controlled. Their apparent power made their actual powerlessness invisible. Their luxury made their captivity deniable. Their compliance, whether genuine or performed, made challenging the system appear unnecessary to most observers. Understanding this requires confronting uncomfortable questions about how societies enable institutional oppression. How religious authority can be manipulated by those who claim to represent it. How administrative competence can serve evil purposes as effectively as it serves good ones. How economic incentives can make exploitation sustainable and even profitable. How official narratives can successfully hide truth for millennia when those narratives serve the interests of powerful institutions. Shepenwepet walked into that chamber in 714 before the Common Era. The system consumed her. She survived through strength and fragmentation and the development of psychological coping mechanisms that allowed endurance without acceptance. She performed public compliance while protecting some fragment of private resistance. She endured for 42 years. She died still captive, still performing, still maintaining the appearance of contentment that the system required. And for 3 millennia, her suffering was hidden beneath inscriptions proclaiming her honor and blessing. She deserves better memorial than official lies. She deserves acknowledgement of what was actually done to her. She deserves recognition as someone who survived systematic exploitation while maintaining fragments of resistance that the system tried but failed to completely eliminate. She deserves to be remembered not as God's wife of Amun, beloved of the god, but as Shepenwepet, daughter of Osorkon, captive for 4 decades, dead at 56, whose bones bear witness to truths that all the elaborate inscriptions tried to hide but could not completely erase. Remember her name. Remember what was done to her. Remember that it was systematic, religiously justified, economically supported, and successfully hidden from honest examination for 3,000 years. Remember that comfortable historical narratives often conceal uncomfortable truths that are harder to accept but more important to understand. Remember that examining those truths requires questioning authority, analyzing gaps in official records, privileging physical evidence over propagandistic text, and being willing to conclude that honored institutions were actually mechanisms of exploitation. If this glimpse into history's hidden darkness has left you wanting to uncover more buried truths, I've prepared another journey into the shadows of the past that you won't want to miss. Click on the video appearing on your screen now to discover another shocking chapter that history tried to erase. And if you found this exploration as compelling as I did, hit that subscribe button so we can continue peeling back the layers of history together. These voices deserve to be heard. Even though they were systematically silenced in their own time through religious language that made honest discussion impossible. These stories deserve to be told, even though powerful institutions tried to erase them through propaganda that persisted for millennia. The truth deserves to emerge, even when lies have had 3,000 years to solidify into accepted history that most people never question. Remember Shep and Weep. Remember all the gods' wives whose names survive in inscriptions that honor them falsely. Remember the women whose names were lost entirely, but whose suffering was equally real, and whose bones tell stories that their mouths were never permitted to speak. Remember that civilization and atrocity are not opposites, but often partners when administrative sophistication combines with moral corruption and religious justification to create systems of systematic exploitation that benefit many while destroying some. The past was not simpler or more innocent than the present. It was complex, brutal, and sophisticated in its capacity for exploitation disguised as honor. Acknowledging that truth is essential because the human capacity for systematic horror did not end with ancient Egypt or with any other historical period. It persists wherever power can combine authority with isolation, wherever religious or ideological language can mask exploitation as service, wherever economic incentives can create networks of support for institutional atrocity that destroys individuals while appearing to elevate them. Remember, question, examine, and refuse to accept official narratives when evidence suggests darker truths beneath the surface. That is how we honor the victims of systematic oppression. That is how we prevent similar systems from emerging in new forms. That is how we ensure that historical truth serves justice rather than propaganda.